Good evening, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to this talk by Siyuen Yin, who's going to speak to us tonight about the MeToo movement in China and their use of virtual techniques for mobilization. We're really delighted to have Siyuen with us today. She is a new arrival in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. She's the new Assistant Professor of Migration and Communication, recently arrived from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and her research looks at social inequalities and resistances in the process of migration and globalization, specifically mediated activism of women and migrant workers. And her work has been published in top journals in the field of communication studies, including Cultural Studies, Media, Culture and Society, and the International Journal of Communication. I want to recognize that we, both Siyuen and I, are located in North Burnaby, and that means that today we are joining this event from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Kwikwetlem, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And I'd like to invite all of you to take a moment to reflect on the your relationship to your territorial space and the people who live within it. I think that's really important right now when we're all connecting in virtual space to take a minute to think about how we are in our real space and our real relationship to territoriality and the land. All right, with that, I am going to turn things over to Siyuen, and really excited to hear your talk today.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for this very kind and nice introduction of me, and thank you for inviting me. And thanks everyone for attending this talk virtually. So I'm very excited about this opportunity to share my work on the specific case of MeToo in China. And this is part of my larger project on feminism and the relationship between feminism and the contemporary Chinese politics. So please allow me to share my screen with you. Hold on. Right. So the title of the talk is Feminist Activism in Digital China, an Intersectional Exploitation of the MeToo Movement. And this talk will be divided into 3 sections. In the first section, I'll be talking about some popular conceptions or misconceptions of feminism. The second section will be devoted to historicizing feminist and women's movements in revolutionary and socialist China, roughly meaning the first half century of the 20th century. And the third section will be specific discussion and analysis about this MeToo case. And I contextualize feminist activism through looking at MeToo in the contemporary digital environment of China. So actually in many parts of the world, in different parts of the world over the last 20th century, started from the mid-19th century, there had been various feminist movements and women's struggles and activism. But feminism has only recently been, probably since the 90s in the West and since the early 21st century globally, being widely discussed and debated in public discourse. And it has been increasingly commodified by neoliberal market as selling points in the form of, or in the discourse of girl power or women power, targeting young girls and women. And of course, it has been attacked both in popular forms or in activist forms. Feminism has faced a lot of attacks by misogynists, the hatred of women and feminism, and it is a global phenomenon. In China specifically, the very popular conceptions of feminism can be categorized into 3 types. And the first type is people commonly argue that or believe that or debate that feminism, in Chinese term called 女性主义 or 女权主义, is just an imported ideology from the West. So it's something, there has been a lot of nationalist defending of the origins of feminism located in the West. as a way to attack feminism as any authentic or original Chinese thought. And the second type is people believe, or the misconception is that feminists are women who hate men. And there's a very stigmatized term in China called 田园女权. And the very literally translation of this is called, could be countryside feminism. And the very third type of popular conception is people who defend feminism, saying that feminism is never about women who hate men, or is never about angry women talking shit about men. It's just about women seeking equal rights with men. So I'll be talking about the problems with these three popular conceptions. The first problem I see with this popular perceptions of feminism is that it ignores the very accomplishments of feminist and women's movement in the history, both in the West and East, or in the so-called first, second, third world, where we use global South and global North in contemporary times. For instance, in the Western countries, in the first wave of feminist movement focusing on women's voting rights, suffrage, and their equal opportunities in employment, education, started in the mid 19th century and lasted until early 20th century, and which is commonly known as the first wave of feminist movement from a liberal perspective. And the second wave in the West focus on women's employment, education rights, and opportunities. And also they bring reproductive rights as one of the main focuses. And they second wave of feminists raised the idea of patriarchy to really characterize this very male privilege and male power. And in entering the 1980s and 90s, there has been increasing demonstrations and movement talking about LGBTQ rights. And around the 90s, transnational intersectional feminism also arises to talk about, for instance, third world women's rights, and also as well as women of color's rights in the United States or in the general Western context. And arguably, a lot of people celebrate this potential of digital media to mobilize feminist actions and movement in entering the 21st century. And people use the term digital feminism or some hashtag feminism, those kind of terms to characterize this new wave. But also at the same time, a lot of feminist cultural studies critiques such as Angela McRobbie or Rosalind Gill, they argue that this is just post-feminism. It's just a post-feminist politics that distract people from the collective actions. And the recent concept by Sarah Benavides, popular feminism, is also talking about this kind of phenomenon that feminism becomes popular with the general public, but the very political meaning and intersectional meaning of feminism has been lost in this popularization of feminism in the popular and commercial discourse and culture. And in the West, in the non-Western countries, women's emancipation movements, which was different from those in the Western countries, which were more independent grassroots. Women's emancipation movements in the non-Western countries have been closely linked with their country's national independent and democratic movements in the early 20th century. And local feminist continued struggles for women's rights and equality in the political, economic, social, and cultural regimes has been going on throughout the 20th century. And there has been different transnational feminist alliances formed among these women, local feminists, fighters, advocates throughout 20th century. So these are the three books written by feminist scholars, which I believe are very important work documenting women's movements and feminist struggles in the non-Western context. For instance, the first book written by Kumari Jayawardena. Kumari is a feminist philosopher and theorist from Sri Lanka. And her book has very important document very important history of women's movements in different parts of so-called East countries, East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Middle East. And she documented how from the late 19th century to the early 20th century, women's movements in these areas, in those colonial or in areas very much occupied or influenced by the colonial imperialist power, women's emancipatory movement have been closely related to its national democratic movement and national independent movement. And the second book by Kirsten Gottsy, she is a feminist anthropologist based in US. And this very book, second title, Second World and Second Sex, is writing about the history during Cold War, when feminist alliances were formed between the Second and Third World, specifically between the East European countries and the Latin American countries and African. So this book is very important. It was just published last year, and it was a very important intervention into this grand narrative about US leadership in the international feminist movement. And the very third book written by the feminist historian Wang Zheng from China, is talking about in the specific period of Mao's socialist China, from China's foundation since the 1949 to before the Cultural Revolution, how socialist feminists who were mostly at the time party officials did enormous contribution to women's equity and rights in China at the time. And my discussion of the very historical context and the stories of feminist movements and women's struggles in the first half century of 20th century of China was basically based on the first and the third book. So the second problem I see with the popular perception of feminism, or what Sarah Benavides defined as popular feminism, is it's overemphasized on the liberal notion of equal rights, which often exclusively focuses on middle class and white women in the West. And in China's context, especially in contemporary China's context, where feminism also becomes such a trendy and popular, although contentious word, that it only focuses on urban middle class women. But we know that feminism has various forms, a range of school sorts, including liberal feminism, radical feminism, socialist feminism, etc. And of course, it's way beyond the scope of this talk to map or to give a comprehensive map of the different schools of feminist thoughts. But I just list some of the thoughts here just to show how feminism, or we can use plural terms of feminisms, have different focuses, though those focuses have overlaps, talking about different forms of unequal power structures. For instance, we have radical feminism talking about emancipation or liberation of women from patriarchy, this very school defines patriarchy as a power system that sustains men's control over women's body and sexuality. It also predominantly focuses on reproductive labor, pornography, and sexual violence. And we also have the scholars. You can name a list of scholars, but I list Catherine McKinney, Alan Willis here. And we also have socialist feminism, which is very much influenced by Marxist thoughts, talking about the emancipation of working class and rural women from the patriarchy and the intertwined relationship or the very intertwined power structures of patriarchy and capitalism's exploitation and oppression. We have Heidi Hartman and the two authors of the book I just talked, Wang Zheng and Kumari. And we also have Black and intersectional feminism, which provide very, very important thoughts, insightful views about talking about specifically looking through Black women's standpoint and their suffering from the structural inequalities along race, gender, and class, and those very well-known scholars, including Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And of course, we have queer feminism, which is against heteronormativity and homonormativity, and the very deconstruction of, they are talking the very deconstruction of identity categories of gender, heterosexuality, and etc. And of course, there are also other schools of thoughts, including indigenous feminism, transnational feminism, environmental, and critical disability studies. So again, it's beyond the scope of this talk to map all the thoughts. But what I want to say or emphasize is that on the very contrary to the popular perception of feminism, widely circulated nowadays among the public discussions and commercial media and popular culture about liberal feminism, feminism can take plural forms, and it's indeed about this interlocking system of oppression. And I borrow this term from Bell Hooks, basically. And I argue that feminisms are both theories and practices, or knowledge and actions that dismantle the very interlocking system of oppression. It can include sexual, racial, heterosexual, class oppressions, capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and imperialism. And it's not only about gendered women from a very liberal, limited way of viewing equality and rights, but it covers varied underprivileged and marginalized groups, and also see the very situation and inequality of women from the very different, from this very interlocking system of oppression. So the second section, I'll be talking about how we can, it's more about mapping the history of women's movement and feminist struggles in China. Since the late 19th century and early 20th century, women's liberation movement became a very important constitutive part of the country of China's bourgeoisie democratic revolution against the feudal dynasty, Qing dynasty, and also as part of the May 4th movement against imperialism. And this is the history, this is actually a very history shared by other third world or East countries, written by Kumari in her book. And in China specifically, this very first wave, we can also call it first wave of feminists, or they never label it as feminists, but more as women's movement. It was led by feminist intellectuals and activists, very well-known like pioneers, feminist pioneers such as Siyuen Yin. And it was also this very women's liberation movement was also at the same time very much supported by the leading male intellectuals, including Lu Xun, which I'm sure anyone who is familiar with China would know he's such a well-known name, and the most, I would say the most influential intellectual in the early 20th century of China. And the very focus of women's movement at the time has some similarity with the first wave of women's movement in the West. They also talk about women's education, women's opportunities and rights in education, employment, including voting rights, as part of this bourgeoisie democratic revolution. And they also focus on the very specific thing about China's culture at the time is that, or this resistant culture at the time is that they aim to dismantle these feudal cultural norms, including women's subordination and male supremacy, which was in Chinese term, 男尊女卑, and also the very feudal cultural practices like foot bonding, child marriage, etc. And these very feudal cultural norms, well, for the female or for the feminist intellectuals and activists at the time, was seen by them as this very oppression for women. While for the male intellectuals, they were taking a more different perspective. Although they were also supporting this dismantling of feudal cultural norms and practices, they were saying that not really from a women's perspective or standpoint, we can call it standpoint of benefits. It's more saying, or from their understanding, it's more that they view these very feudal cultural norms that oppress women in certain ways. It's really impeding, or it's really having negative impact for China to seek modernity, democracy, and national independence at the time. So there was this slight difference that I would emphasize. And entering, or from the second decade of 19th century to the 60s, right before the Cultural Revolution. And this part of the discussion is mainly based on the some documents and also Professor Wang Zhong's book, Finding Women in the State. So this, I call it the socialist revolution and construction era. And in the very beginning of the 1920s, many feminist intellectuals and activists who were very much influenced by the pioneer generations, feminists like Siyuen Yin in the revolutionary era, they joined the Communist Party in the 1920s, and they worked closely with those party members at the time and successfully mobilized a lot of rural and working class women in the socialist revolution. But at the very time, feminism was regarded as bourgeoisie, or bourgeoisie Western thought, which excluded rural and working class women. So feminist political activists who joined the Communist Party in the 20s and the Socialist Revolution, they cautiously avoided to use the label feminism. Instead, they used women's work or women's movements. And also a lot of there were a lot of debates also among those party officials, especially the views taken by the male officials. They were saying that the main contradiction, so this is a very consistent bias shared among those international communist movements, activists or revolutionaries. They were saying that gender inequality is just secondary to the class inequality. So women's issue should not be focused or prioritized, or should not distract the very struggle over the very class contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie at the time. And after the founding of, and this is also the pattern in China's history in the 20s, and this very thought lasts to the socialist construction of the modern China. And after the founding of PRC, People's Republic of China in 1949, these feminists, they became political leaders in the party state, who were also the main force in enacting a lot of laws and policies to protect women's rights. And this is the cover of a magazine published in 1959. The title is 中国妇女. It's like Chinese women. So they use 妇女 instead of 女性 as a way to really represent a socialist female subject or subject position. And the very accomplishments of China's socialist feminism they have a lot of accomplishments and achievement. For instance, the very establishment of the National Women's Organization, All Women's Federation China in 1949. And this organization, for any of you who know China, now we call it Fulian, and now it almost lost its popularity or even legitimacy among the majority of women in China in contemporary political context. But when it was first founded in 1949, when the PRC was founded, it was a very, very important national association where a lot of feminist political leaders were at the time, they were taking positions there. And this is a national organization specifically for the rights of women workers, women students, housewives, etc. And they focus on advocating policy changes in favoring of women's interests and benefits in the area of education, employment, and marriage. And the very first law of PRC was marriage law, which was legislated in 1950, in the year of 1950. And this very law, particular law, abandoned child marriage and legislated monogamous marriage and women's equal rights in the marriage institution, which was a very, very, at the time, at least progressive change compared with this marriage system in the feudal time. And also, women have been, from both the working class, rural, and the urban middle class women, they have been greatly and enormously mobilized to leave family or to escape the very boundary of family, to participate in the socialist collective production. They really create this very glorious labor subject as women workers. And at the same time, well, it was critiqued by a lot of radical feminists like Catherine McKinney as saying this really dismissed the very agency and the specific situation of women. Well, it's still a debatable point, and we can talk about that later in a Q&A. But if we put that very emancipation of women from families to participate in the collective production, rural women, working class women, and bourgeoisie women in the very historical context of China, and compare with the prior era in the feudal China, it is a really great step to make, or a great achievement that have been made. And also, women in urban and rural areas, they were also encouraged and mobilized to become active political leaders, to participate in the party, administrative, and cadres. And women's agency was glorified, and their power was glorified, which is very different from and a departure from their very passive victim image in both feudal China and the revolutionary China. And we can see the pictures on the left. The picture on the very top is the very famous slogan in Chinese, "Women hold up the half sky." I'm sure many of you have heard this. And Mao get a lot of credit for this slogan, which inspired a lot of women to really claim their agency in working and in all kind of power regimes. But actually, Dr. Wang Zheng's book have documented this history, saying that it should be attributed to the tremendous effort by those female or feminist party leaders who did so much work behind this thing, and without having their names, because of a lot of male supremacy or even misogynist attitudes within the party administration or party cadre. But luckily, they were at the time, very supported by the chairman Mao. So it gave them a lot of space to really navigate a different politics. A lot of politics are very negative at the time for them. And the second picture is, it's like a state, I wouldn't say propaganda, but it's a state picture of glorifying women's labor or women's collective agency in labor in the socialist collective production as both rural women and working class women. So the very legacy of the socialist feminism in China, in Mao's China, include women's social status having remarkably improved, sorry about the typo, and gender equality, for instance, this women hold up the half sky, became a commitment of the party state as part of its discursive commitment to socialist egalitarianism. And women's independence, or this very idea or even ideology of women's independence and emancipation at the time, has entrenched as social and cultural areas, which was not only a great improvement compared with this very feudal women's oppression in the feudal era, but also it has great impact on women's idea about their power, also about their longing for independence in contemporary time after the socialist China. And we see the poster on the left is portraying the couple freedom, and the slogan says freedom of marriage, happiness and joy. And the other one is women hold up the half sky and to build a whole new world. But at least from the literature and the scholars' discussions I've viewed, they either say or attack socialist feminism as just a male-led or state feminism project, or just have a lot of kind of nostalgia feeling of the socialist past. But my understanding of this, the very legacy or the very understanding of socialist feminism in Mao's China should be, I would argue it's or term is as an unfinished task. So it has a lot of legacy, but it also has a lot of limitations. But it should not be simply dismissed as a male-led state feminism. If we recognize the tremendous effort by those female leaders, as feminist leaders, as well as those thousands of millions of women, rural women, working class women's effort in all kinds of collective production. And the problem is that they haven't, because of all kinds of, again, this contentious era of talking about women's issues, gender inequality, and even patriarchy, this very masculinist and patriarchal ideas and systems, I argue, still persist. It didn't really fully challenge or fully dismantle this power structures, this male supremacy. For instance, feminist leaders, they have to be constantly engaging in this process of self-effacing, that they don't claim the credit they should have to claim for the effort they do, just to avoid those hostile attitudes or those very orthodox Marxist attacks from those male leaders. And women still have limited education and employment opportunities. And because of this emphasizing of women workers, the very agency or very image of women workers, and masculinity is, I would say, both implicitly and explicitly believed or constructed as superior to femininity. And on the marriage side, although this very established of modern China's marriage law is really a progressive change compared with the rural regime, marriage remains a private, heterosexual, and patriarchal institution as it is in many other countries now and in the history. And the reproductive work was still primarily women's burden, even in Mao's socialist China, where there has been immense effort to really emancipate women from this family or housework. It's still the very this very revolution or this very activism or this very movement has not really reached its goals. And so entering since the 1980s, when China began this initiated economic reform, which many people argue, like David Harvey argue, as this neoliberal transition or neoliberal authoritarian transition of China, along with US and UK's neoliberal reform. And the very development of women's advocacy on women's rights and movement have moved slightly from the state feminism or state socialism feminism to the more NGO-based, organizational-based feminism. And for instance, the very milestone event was the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women was held in Beijing, China. And international theorists, activists, advocacy groups, and associations from all over the world, they came to Beijing and closely work with the NGOs and also the All Women Federation China at the time. They were the main organizations behind this. And it was also very much supported by Chinese government at that time. And because due to its, we can say, discursive commitment to gender equity, which is still a discursive commitment in contemporary Chinese government's discourse. And one of the characteristics of the activists and NGOs in China in this time, which a lot of people, which I agree, call it as post-socialist China or neoliberal China, is that they have most of the staff members and the leaders from those NGOs, they hold or held close ties to the political power. Many of them were the retired feminist party leaders in the socialist era, and they had a lot of connections and ways to navigate different resources to help them to organize all kinds of campaigns, advocacy. And for instance, the very foundation, the very founding of the development center for rural women, the very first NGO focusing on Chinese rural women, was also established in the mid 1990s. And this the figure who established this NGO was the retired a female party official, and she used her resources to establish this and really address the very development issues of rural women's equity and rights, especially in their education and career development. And the pictures on the right are some pictures about the Fourth World Conference on Women. We see that people from activist theories and leaders from all over the world joined the meeting and discussed various kinds of issues and events. And in the very contemporary, in the past decade, this very shift. So we can see the very third wave, we can call it third wave, or the very last stage of feminist or women's activism and advocacy. They were mostly in the form of NGOs and those leaders having close ties with the government or the party political power. Well, in the past decade, there has been increasing feminist activism, mainly by college students and activists, including some domestic and diaspora activists, who are mainly educated and middle-class women. They become this main force of feminist activism. And the very characteristics of the feminist activism in this very period include, they have very different from the prior generations. These women activists, participants, they have very little ties with the party state and political power. So they are basically, from a social movement perspective, they are basically, we can say, bottom up or grassroots. And another very notable and noticeable feature is that these activists, they explicitly self-identify themselves as feminists. This is a great, or I would say a huge change from the prior generations, including the, I would say, Mao's area, and the revolutionary area, Mao's area, and the early reform era. So these women have very explicit identify or embody this identity as feminists, and they have a very radical perspective or very radical goals and aims to change this very patriarchal system of China. And they've heavily relied on internet and social media and have organized various forms of small protests and exhibits and collective actions, both online and offline. And the picture we can see from the left, on the very top, is the protest by several feminist activists with the slogan saying, "Stop domestic violence." And the other one, the picture on the top right, is the diaspora feminists holding slogans, who participate in the Women's March. I think last year or the year before, to show their solidarity. And the one on the down left is women protesting against domestic violence, with a slogan saying, "Where are you when they are suffering from violence?" So it is saying that it is really advocating people to step in and stop doing taking this bystander role. And the one on the down right is several like college students. Some college students support a feminist organization or an independent feminist media, feminist voice. They say the very poster they hold were saying, we want to listen to feminist voice. And this very feminist voice is the first independent feminist media in China and established in early 2010. And it has attracted a lot of followers and public attention, because due to its very clearly articulated radical feminist standpoint, fighting all kinds of sexism, male privilege, as well as the homophobia widely existing in China. But this very media was forced to shut down the year before last year, I think, and due to unknown reasons. We can characterize as either platform surveillance, or it's just out of the state surveillance or coercive power. But it also shows this very tolerance from the top political power over both feminism, feminist activism, and feminist activism is very little. And among this activism or this very new form, a new wave of feminist activism in China, gender violence is one of the main, or sexual violence is one of the main focuses for this type of feminism. And MeToo, the very case of MeToo, is specifically, I would say, emerging from this very context, although it has been developed as a transnational movement. So just to give you some brief background, which I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with the story of MeToo, since it has been such a hot topic in the past 2 years or 3 years. Just a brief overview of this transnational flow of the MeToo movement. So it was originally initiated in US in 2017. And it has, since then, this movement have spread all over the world as a transnational feminist movement against sexual harassment and assault. It really challenged a lot of merits from this movement. It challenged victim blaming, which is very widely circulating in the rape culture, the patriarchal rape culture. And it also encouraged a lot of silenced women who were either silenced from this victim blaming or any type of toxic masculinity or misogynist cultural environment, to really speak up of their experiences of being sexually harassed or assaulted. And also a lot of activism and collective actions all over the world, they advocate not only at a individual visibility level and voices level, they also successfully advocated institutional changes in laws and policies. And there has been thousands of marches and protests worldwide to join this MeToo movement against sexual violence. But a lot of people also, of course, this movement face critiques and it has limitations. Some people argue that it's just another form of hashtag activism that only focuses on visibility. And if, for instance, in Sarah Benavisa's book, recent published book about popular feminism, she specifically talks about the limitation of MeToo movement in the Western context, where it becomes a trendy thing for people to just post something about MeToo to increase visibility, where in the, we would say, more ideal or expected feminist movement, visibility should be means to raise social and public awareness of the inequality and to reach an end towards changes. However, in the very hashtag, or we can call social media activism environment, visibility, because of all kinds of trending and possibility of participating in something popular online, visibility becomes an end. and it just stays at the surface, and it no longer move forward to change the structure, and it really lose this very collective work political potential and for mobilizing collective actions. And people also argue that, from a more intersectional perspective, argue that in the Western world, white middle-class women are more active, and for instance, or they are more actively participating in this movement to speak up because they have the privilege or whatever entitlement to speak up in this movement. For instance, the case of the Tarana Burke, for many of you, I'm sure, already know this. This very hashtag #MeToo was first started by her, Tarana, as a Black feminist activist in almost 10 years ago, but it was not really adopted, and it didn't really reach the wide public, as not until the Hollywood star the female actress started to use this label in 2017, 10 years ago, that attracts so much public discussions and media reports worldwide. And for instance, Daniel's recent published article talk about, in US context, review how women of color, working class women, are very much marginalized and excluded, who were in this very Me Too movement, who didn't really have the social economic capital to really speak up or to really jeopardize their jobs to speak up against the institutional sexual violence. And these are just some pictures of the women's marches and protests worldwide. And the picture on the top left, the lady in the middle, Me Too Survivors March, is Tarana. And we have women's protests and marches of Me Too in South Korea, in India, as well as in Canada here. People widely talk about this rape culture and victim blaming, all kinds of institutionalized and systematic violence against women. So the very rise of the Me Too movement in China was specifically stimulated. Well, of course, it was very much inspired and encouraged by this transnational wave of Me Too and this anti-sexual harassment assault campaign. It was stimulated by several high-profile instances in 2018, including two very high-profile cases, Luo Qianqian's real name report of Chen Xiaowu. And the picture, a snapshot I put on the right, is the news article, the title, where, well, the original article, not the news report, the original article, Luo Qianqian report, this very well-established professor of sexual harassing and assaulting her and several other female students. And the very result, it immediately attract a huge amount of public attention, public discussions, and media reports, both domestic and international. And the very results of this cases, or this rise of the Me Too movement, were the two predator male professors from the very prestigious universities who were reported after investigation, they were fired. And there have been numerous media reports, both domestic and international, and public discussions about these cases. And a lot of, in particular in the area of the NGOs and also the media industry, a lot of people, a lot of women, very brave women, stand up and report the predators, the very famous, like the famous hosts, or the very well-known respect male leaders in those fields. And those cases are still very much controversial and now. But so those are the more like high-profile cases. And among those high-profile cases, a lot of people, a great many people, spoke up, ordinary people, and shared experiences on Chinese social media, specifically Weibo and Douban, using the very hashtag #MeToo. They are also invent a new hashtag in Chinese, #MeToo, which in the pronunciation is very similar to MeToo in English. And in my very specific analysis of this case, I basically used two concepts of intersectionality and counterpublics from Kimberly Crenshaw, Nancy Fraser, and Anne Trevor. So this very intersectionality original raised by Kimberly Crenshaw is talking about this race and gender intertwined race and gender inequalities of Black women, especially when they face domestic violence. They didn't really have the privilege as their white sisters or white middle-class sisters to really speak up against their male predators. To really, this intersectionality, this very concept of intersectionality becomes a very powerful concept to really describe this very intertwining power relations that women face beyond the gender inequality. And Nancy Fraser and Anne Trevor's subaltern counterpublics and feminist progressive counterpublics are talking about the very discursive area that subaltern groups, feminists, and progressive people occupy to really speak up or challenge the dominant mainstream public sphere or the discursive arenas. And feminists can be defined as those who identify themselves as feminists and possess feminist ideas and values. And the progressive group can be anyone who contests existing unequal power relations and norms and values that reinforce all kinds of domination, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And the subaltern refers to subordinate groups and people, including various disadvantaged and marginalized social groups. And my major finding of this of the participants or the mechanism of participation in China's MeToo movement is that it mainly constitutes two groups, or I would say two discursive areas, counterpublics that really have overlaps with each other and interact a lot with each other. The first one is the feminist counterpublics, which were mostly constituted by domestic and diaspora activists, very vocal feminist activists and NGO staff members, NGO activists, and scholars who identify themselves as feminists and vocally very explicitly challenge patriarchal power and culture. And their voices appear in media interviews. Well, something that I need to clarify is that in media interviews, it's more their voices more appear in the international media interviews and the domestic independent or alternative media interviews, not in the domestic mainstream media interviews, which don't really interview those people. And social media, and of course they use their own social media platforms and various institutional social media platforms to talk about these issues and to really push the liberal understanding of gender equity in the sexual violence case to a structural understanding and to advocate this systematic and structural change against patriarchy. And there have been also a lot of people who are very much concerned with gender equity and sexual violence in China. And I define them as constituting this discursive arena of pro-change counterpublics. So they were talking about, so these people, the very, very prominent, it's 7 o'clock, people are honoring the health workers outside. So the very characteristic of these groups is that first, they are very much concerned of the gender equity and the sexual violence issue. And second, they are very cautiously or consciously distance themselves from the identity of feminism. And we can say there are, of course, a lot of reasons behind those. So their talk about this violence, they share a lot of stories and experiences of how prevalent sexual harassment and assault are in China, in universities, at workplace, and in public spaces, as well as other countries. And they talk about this silencing, women's being silenced and victim blaming. And a lot of women lack of institutional support and protection, so they are very discouraged to speak up or to seek support or to even report those predators when they face or encounter sexual harassment. And this long quote is from a post about Me Too on social media Weibo. And I think this quote represents or can summarize a lot of ideas held by this particular group of pro-change counter-publics. So the person was saying, I'm not a so-called feminist, but I sincerely wish that one day women can have fair and equal treatment. Why do women have to be discriminated against and hurt just because of their gender? I don't know much about feminism, but I know in China, it is rather difficult to protect women's rights. Having seen so many women and girls suffering through the Me Too movement, as a woman myself, I feel so sad and I deeply respect and admire their courageous voices. I wish all of those who have been hurt can recover and move on. So this type of discourse and this type of support and this type of voices have been huge, enormous in China's social movement, social media platforms. And the picture on the left, it's a supporting group people form actually very recently, last month, by on the social media, Douban, as a support group for, I would say as a continued activism or form of activism, everyday activism, participated by ordinary people in this so-called we can call it post Me Too era. But if we look at from the more intersectional perspective, we can see the narratives in China's Me Too movement among the two big discursive arenas, the feminist counterpublics and the pro-change counterpublics. The voices from, or the narratives were mostly about urban middle-class women's experiences at workplace, in universities, or in public spaces, while discussions on rural women and working class women's sufferings from sexual violence or all types of everyday harassment or assault in villages, in factories, and in domestic spaces were largely absent in China's Me Too movement. Despite of some favoring government discourses on the prevention of sexual assault and harassment, the state, so after the Me Too movement or after the rise of Me Too movement, they're actually having a lot of official and mainstream media discourse talking about how we can prevent sexual harassment, assault, without really referencing to the Me Too movement or feminist activism on the ground. On the other hand, the party state has exerted coercive power over Me Too as a bottom-up Me Too movement. And we argue that this is attributed to two reasons. The first one is, again, this continuous intolerance, or we can see from the very history, the very legacy of this. Either we say it's a very orthodox Marxist view of feminism or gender, or it's just misogynist attitudes towards women or feminists. So overall, it's a party, it really combined into this party state's continuous intolerance over feminism as resistant political struggles and grassroots movements without really attaching itself to the political power or etc. And posts were deleted on social media. By the time we collected data on social media about Me Too last summer, almost all the Me Too, almost all the hashtag Me Too on Weibo were deleted. Well, you can now still see the hashtag Me Too on Weibo, but all those has very little relation with Chinese experiences. It's more talking about Me Too in the other countries. But luckily, some feminist groups that I was in, they have saved a lot of data, the documents, and through PDFs. And also there are still a lot of posts on Douban, probably because it's not as visible as Weibo in China. And the offline actions, the public exhibits organized by activists in the South China, mainly in South China, were completely shut down. And college students protest in the universities against the sexual harassment, in the prevalence of sexual harassment in universities, and also the lack of institutional report and actions to really punish this kind of actions were very much suppressed by the universities. And of course, there are, not surprisingly, there were a lot of misogynist attacks over the people, especially over those high-profile cases. People question the very motivations of the exposers, those reporters, using conspiracy theories and discourses. And they blame, again, this very victim blaming culture is so prevalent. They blame the victims for misconduct, saying it must be some misconducts or misbehavior of the victims that really lead to this situation of they're being harassed or assaulted. And in conclusion, we argue that this very, or we come with the term saying digital feminism without guarantees. So we really acknowledge that digital, or recognize that digital technologies do mediated the ongoing feminist actions with new possibilities for higher visibility and greater access, as we can see from MeToo movement, as well as other feminist movement in China and beyond, and global, transnationally. And anchoring, but at the same time, we see that there are still many limitations with those approaches, and also this very dilemma with visibility has to be addressed by this increasing celebratory discourse towards digital feminism. And anchoring the global trend, feminism becomes a buzzword, popular word, associated with neoliberalism and consumerism in China as well. Transnational feminist movements such as MeToo do have significant implications for revitalizing the very collective actions and political goals which lie at the very core of feminist struggles. And to undermine the interlocking systems of oppression, if we go back to the, when we talk about the feminism, is not only about gender and women's equal rights with men. It has targeted so many different forms of interlocking systems of oppression. And to undermine such in specific contexts, feminist movements should construct more inclusive agenda and adopt various mobilizing strategies to foster greater participation. As we can see or learn from China's MeToo case, it has a lot of merits and great potential, but it's exclusively focusing on urban middle-class educated women, where like hundreds of millions of rural women and working class women in the factories, in villages, and in the domestic sphere, they are daily suffering from sexual violence or all kinds of violence, have been largely absent in this very MeToo movement in China. And there are actually many studies documenting, mainly from sociology and anthropology, documenting women suffering, working class women and rural women suffering from sexual violence in both public and domestic spaces. But this is not, it has not been really addressed by the MeToo movement in China, even not addressed by the feminist groups, activists, and scholars. And also, we argue that making feminist ideas, we should make feminist ideas more comprehensible through campaigning for different cases and strategically navigating political opportunities. And this is essential to extend the feminist counter sphere or counter public sphere to everyday citizens. If we go back to the very long quote from the one of the participants, the ordinary people in belonging to the pro-change counter publics, we can see that There are people, millions of people who are genuinely concerned with women's rights, gender equity, but because of this very different types of popular misconceptions or even negative or even stigmatization of feminism, they really distance themselves. So how can we really enhance this feminism as really a complex systems of theories and actions that is broad and that is for political changes, for radical changes? How can we reach that idea to the general public? Should be, we argue, be one of the focuses for the future digital feminism movement. Especially, this is especially important in the context where we see the idea of feminism, especially the liberal idea of feminism of equal rights or women's independence, etc., has been so pervasively and even aggressively adopted by the commercial neoliberal culture, like lean in or encouraging individual women to really step up or to do to empower themselves through purchasing, through doing plastic surgery, to take their beauty as capital. Since feminism has been so much taken up by this kind of popular, trendy neoliberal culture, how can we feminist scholars or feminist activism really reoccupy this, or we can say in storehouse where popular is always a contested area? How can we occupy this popular sphere and to really win back the very political and collective and intersectional agendas and the potential of feminism and feminist activism and movement to really make the bigger, inclusive, and structural changes? Would be really something we need to think about in the digital age. So I think that's so much for this study. And thank you for your attention and participation again. So any thoughts, comments, and questions?
So thank you very much, Siyuen. That was really wonderful. I particularly want to thank you for first of all, describing this really fabulous case study and using it to complicate and complexify these concepts that are often presented as just given, and especially doing the work of historicizing feminism in the Chinese context. I know that that's an extra burden when you're presenting ideas from the East in the West to share that history and educate people on how to think about these concepts in that context. So I really want to thank you so much.